Hello, everyone. Welcome to this ASLO webinar on peer review. My name is Rosie Gradeville. I'm the 2021 to 2023 Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellow, and I'm excited to be hosting this event today. Here's how it's going to work. We'll first have our panelists introduce themselves. Then we'll have a short presentation giving some practical guidance for reviewing manuscripts. And then the majority of our time today will be a question and answer session with ASLO editors where you can ask them all your questions about peer review. There is a large audience today, so I can't let you all introduce yourselves. Instead, I will introduce you. We know based on the pre-registration questions that our audience today includes people from diverse career stages, including students and postdocs and professors and other scientists. And you have a diverse relationship with review. About a quarter of you are experienced reviewers, half of you are new to review, and a quarter of you have never reviewed before. So thank you all for being here, and I look forward to a fun discussion today.
Hi, my name is Bridget Deemer, and I'm the 2020 to 2022 Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellow. I'm really excited to be part of this webinar today and to talk about the peer review process and sort of demystify the process for early career folks who I don't think get enough formal training on something that's really important and critical to the scientific publication process.
Hi, I'm Dave Hambright. I'm the editor-in-chief of Limnology and Oceanography. As ASLO's flagship journal, we publish scientific articles, reviews, and comments ranging across the many diverse topics and disciplines pertaining to the aquatic sciences. It is truly a pleasure for me to be part of this peer review webinar that has been organized by the Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellows, specifically Rosie and Bridget. I want to thank you both for your hard work and dedication. When it comes to peer review at L&O, it is no secret that I frequently boast about the quality of our reviewers, who are equaled only by our authors and our editorial board members. These three groups I consider to be the foundational pillars upon which L&O relies and upon which L&O's reputation exists. I have seen a preview of Rosie's overview of the peer review process. It is quite informative, and I believe you will find it to be quite valuable. And I'm certainly looking forward to the Q&A portion of the webinar following Rosie's presentation. Let me end this brief introduction by letting you all know you are always welcome to contact me. Here are my email addresses. Feel free to reach out to me for any reason, whether related to the journal or not. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Julie Milani. I'm the Deputy Editor of Limnology and Oceanography. So that means that I, in addition to working as a regular Associate Editor, I take on the role of Editor-in-Chief for these special issues, and also I help Dave with setting the direction of the journal and sometimes take on Editor-in-Chief for normal papers when there's a conflict of interest. I want to thank the Raelyn Cole Fellows for inviting me. They've put together a really great webinar, or a really great set of instructions, a guide to peer review, so that's a great place to start. And in general, I'm just really happy to be an ASLO editor because I find that the reviews we get for Limnology and Oceanography are almost without exception really high quality every time. So feel free to ask your questions and hopefully we can provide some good guidance. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jim Cloran. I am the editor of Limnology and Oceanography Letters. This is ASLO's news journal. It's all open access publications, and it features short-length letters formatted articles. All of the editors of ASLO journals are here for this webinar. And first we want to thank the Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellows who conceived and organized this webinar. We know that you're here because you're interested in peer review and how peer review works, how it's done, how editors use peer review in making editorial decisions. So we're here at the invitation of the fellows, and they thought it would be useful for you to have access to editors to pose questions about the peer review process. So my kind of opening message here is the editors are here. We're ready, willing, and able to try to answer your questions, and so please don't hesitate.
Hello, I'm Paul Kemp. I'm editor-in-chief of Limnology and Oceanography Methods, one of ASLO's 4 existing journals. ASLO Methods was initiated in 2002, published its first papers in 2003. So it's now in its 18th volume, 18th year. As you might guess from the name, it focuses on methods, the presentation of new methods, evaluation of existing methods, comparisons of methods, reviews about methods. The ASLO editors have quite often had sessions on reviewing and authorship and how to be a better author and a better reviewer. This is an exceptional opportunity that I'm very glad to participate in. I understand there are well over 200 people signed up for this session. I thank the Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellows for organizing this session, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Filstrup. I'm the editor of the Limnology and Oceanography Bulletin. The Bulletin is the community forum journal of the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography. I like to think of it as a platform where we can have discussions within our community, or at least begin those discussions. In that respect, the Bulletin is a little bit different from the peer-reviewed journals within the ASLO portfolio. Content within the Bulletin is written in more of a conversational tone. So think about an article that you might see within a magazine. That's the kind of contributions that we're looking for. The nice thing is we also have a lot of flexibility within the content that we can publish. In addition to feature articles, we publish viewpoints, news items concerning ASLO or the broader scientific community in general. We publish meeting highlights, institute profiles, as well as book reviews. And I should say that the Bulletin, like other journals, is really driven by the contributions of our community. So we're always looking for great content. I love having conversations about developing content. So if you have some ideas of something you would like to see in the Bulletin, please reach out. I also want to note that Laura Falkenberg will be taking over as editor-in-chief of the Bulletin beginning next January. And she has a lot of great ideas for the future vision of the Bulletin. So stay tuned for that. And thinking about peer review, I just want to say peer review is a process. It takes time. It takes a lot of practice to develop those skills. And that's why you are here today. So I appreciate you attending, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Hello again, this is Rosie. And for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go over some practical guidance on how to prepare reviews. This presentation is mostly based off of advice from the ASLO editors. I sent a survey out to all of the associate editors for the ASLO journals and received 25 responses. And I also included input from the 4 ASLO editors-in-chief. I used some other materials as well. There's a lot of great resources out there for how to perform effective review. So I've listed some of those here for your reference. Let's start by thinking about how peer review fits into the publishing workflow. When an author submits a paper for publication, the first thing that happens is an editorial check. At ASLO, this is a 3-part check. The manuscript first goes to the publishing office. The publishing office pre-screens it to make sure that it adheres to the style and format requirements outlined in the author guidelines. It's actually pretty common for articles to get returned to authors at this point for corrections. Assuming a manuscript makes it through the publishing office, it then goes to the editor-in-chief, who checks to make sure that the article fits within the scope of the journal and also checks it for merit. At LNO letters, there's about a 5% desk rejection rate at this point. The editor-in-chief then invites an associate editor, or AE, to handle the article. And it's that associate editor who chooses and invites reviewers. So next, the manuscript goes out for review. Reviewers are invited. Some reviewers accept those invitations. They prepare their reviews and they send them back to the editors. This is, of course, the main topic we're talking about today. And then there's an editorial decision. This is a two-part decision. First, the associate editor reads the reviews and makes a recommendation. And then the editor-in-chief takes what the reviewers and the associate editor said and makes a final decision on whether the manuscript is accepted, rejected, or sent back for revisions. And at L&O letters, there's about a 50% rejection rate after review. So today we're going to talk about some questions related to the peer review process. How are reviewers selected? What does a useful review look like from the perspective of editors? What's a good process for writing a review? And how are reviews used to make an editorial decision? So first, how are reviewers selected? This is one of the questions that I asked ASLO associate editors in a survey that I sent out. And these were their most common answers. Most ASLO editors said that they use an author-suggested reviewer. When you author a paper, you have the option to suggest reviewers that would be appropriate for your manuscript. So most editors use someone from that list. They also ask people that they know to be experts in the field. Many use auto-generated reviewer lists. These are generated through the online system that ASLO uses. And in order for your name to pop up, you have to already be in the database. So when you registered for this webinar, you should have had the option to add your name as a potential ASLO reviewer. If you would like to do that, you can also email me with this address here. ASLO editors also often mention that they try to solicit diverse reviewers, including a diversity of career stage, and some specifically mentioned they really try to find early career researchers. They also use internet searches and the manuscript references list within the manuscript itself to find appropriate reviewers. A lot of editors noted how it's becoming increasingly difficult to find reviewers who accept the invitation to review. So for instance, one editor said that they had a record of 11 declines for a single manuscript. Another said they had to invite about 15 people to get 3 willing reviewers. This is part of a growing trend where editors have to send out more and more invitations in order to generate one review. This is because there's more and more manuscripts being submitted for publication, and the reviewer pool isn't growing at the same rate as the manuscript submissions are growing. So having more reviews from students, postdocs, and other early career researchers can help to solve this problem. We're really an untapped pool of potential reviewers. So ASLO encourages reviews from early career researchers. There's a few ways that you can do this. If a senior scientist is asked to review a paper and can't review, they can provide the name of an early career researcher as an alternate reviewer. ASLO also supports joint peer review, where a mentor or advisor reviews a paper together with a student or mentee. And finally, again, you can add your name to the ASLO reviewer database. When thinking about how many papers you should review, it's a good idea to keep in mind the 2-for-1 rule. When you author a paper, you usually receive at least 2 reviews. So that means that you should try to review at least 2 papers for every paper that you first author. That will keep the system balanced. And because of this increasing difficulty in finding willing reviewers, ASLO editors asked you for a few favors. Please respond to your review requests promptly. Even if the answer is no, you can't review this paper, it's really helpful if you give them the answer right away instead of waiting for a few days. Always suggest alternate reviewers when you can. And try your best to turn in reviews on time. If you do need a little extra time, it's totally okay to ask for an extension, but don't agree to review a paper and just never turn it in. Okay, so what does a useful review look like from the perspective of an editor? This is another question that I asked the ASLO editors, and these are their most common answers. Most editors said that a useful review argues why a paper should be published or not, describing its strengths and weaknesses. This is important to do for positive reviews as well as negative reviews. The argument for why you feel this paper is worthy of publication or not really matters. A useful review also explains how a paper can be improved. We want to give constructive criticism with concrete suggestions, and if possible, we want to make sure that those suggestions are feasible to actually implement. A useful review also includes specific comments. You may need to refer to line numbers. A useful review explains how the paper fits into the current state of knowledge and moves the field forward. Remember that when you're reviewing a paper, you might be more of an expert on this particular topic than the associate editor. So it's really helpful for them to explain how this paper fits into the bigger picture. It can also be helpful to discuss your own background and expertise in the review. You might not be an expert on every part of this paper or every method that the authors use. And noting that can really help editors reconcile conflicting reviewer comments. Finally, a useful review always uses appropriate and polite tone. The editors also noted some common pitfalls to try to avoid when you're reviewing a paper. First, a common pitfall is focusing on the details of a paper instead of the major issues. This is especially common with early career researchers. So for instance, there's no need to fix grammar mistakes or sentence structure. We're trying to focus on the major scientific ideas. Another common pitfall is an extremely lengthy review. Really useful reviews can be 1 or 2 pages, so there's no need for you to write a 10-page review. Really short, extremely positive, or extremely negative reviews aren't helpful. The helpful part is explaining why a paper is worthy of publication or not. Try not to be vague. It's good to have concrete comments. That way the author can know how to fix the issues. Another common mistake is reviewing the paper you wish the authors had written instead of the actual paper in front of you. It's also a bad idea to include personal opinions or biases in your review. The comments should be as objective as possible. In general, it's not appropriate to ask authors to cite your own work. And finally, a common pitfall is inappropriate tone or language within the review. Everybody has bad days, and if you're reviewing a paper, you may become frustrated. So it's really important to read what you've written and make sure that it is all appropriate and polite before you submit your review. I took this example from PLOS, which shows a before and after of a reviewer comment. So the before statement was using inappropriate tone, and the after statement uses appropriate tone and is also constructive. So maybe when you read a manuscript, you think the writing is so bad, it's practically unreadable. I could barely bring myself to finish it. A more appropriate way to say that same idea could be, while the study appears to be sound, the language is unclear, making it difficult to follow. I advise the authors work with a writing coach or copy editor to improve the flow and readability of the text. Next, I'd like to share an example of a method for reviewing papers. So you're invited to review a paper. You should first think about whether you have time to review this paper. If not, promptly decline the review invitation and suggest alternate reviewers. If you do have time to review, consider whether you have the appropriate expertise. If not, again, promptly decline. But if you do have the appropriate expertise, then consider whether you have a conflict of interest with any of the authors of the paper. Conflicts of interest include previous mentee-supervisor relationships, working at the same institution, being on the same grant together, being a recent co-author with any of the authors. If you have any questions about what constitutes a conflict of interest, please email the editor to ask. And if you do determine you have that conflict, then again, decline the review invitation. But if you don't have a conflict, at this time, you could go on and accept the review invitation and do your first reading. We suggest that your first reading is a quick one where you skim the article, assess the big picture, and you could also consider writing the first 2 paragraphs of the review at this time. What you're trying to determine with this first reading is which of these three categories the article falls into. Is it publishable in principle? Is there a major flaw that stops you considering it for publication at this time, but that major flaw could be addressed in principle? Or is it fatally flawed and there's really nothing that could be done to make this article ready to be accepted in this journal? So if the article is publishable in principle, that's when you'll provide a full review. In this case, you'll go on to do a second reading and an optional third reading where you assess the scientific details and the organization and writing, and then you'll write your review. After you write your review, we suggest that you set it down and reread it on another day before you submit it. This way you can check that your review is understandable, but also that you use appropriate language and tone. Then you can go ahead and submit your review. So if there's a major flaw that would stop this article from being published, instead of writing a full review, you could just document and substantiate that flaw. You can indicate that you're willing to provide a full review if needed, but that way you can save yourself the time from writing a full review when there's a very, very major problem. Again, we suggest that you set down the review and reread it another day before submitting. And same thing if there is a fatal flaw in the manuscript. In that case, you can just document and substantiate the flaw and save yourself the time of writing a full review. In terms of the general review structure, you should check the specific journal you're reviewing for to see if they have any specific formatting requirements. But in general, it's good to think of this inverted pyramid structure where you start with the most important points and end with any detailed comments. It's not necessary to write a full summary of the article itself to start your review, but what is important to start with is whether the major conclusions are supported, the significance of the article and its contribution to the field, and your overall summary assessment. So whether you think that this article is close to publishable, whether there are some minor flaws, major flaws, or whether it is fatally flawed. And remember that you can also provide confidential remarks to the editor, as well as the remarks that the authors see. Reviewing papers takes time. So how can you save time when reviewing? One way to save time is to write very short reviews if there's a fatal flaw or a serious problem with the paper, as we just talked about. You can also contact the associate editor if for a number of reasons. For instance, if the presentation of the manuscript is so poor that you can't understand the content, then contact the associate editor. Or if after reading the paper the first time you realize that you're actually not well suited to review, contact the editor. If you are doing a full review, you can save time by being concise. It's your job to evaluate the paper and provide constructive comments so that the authors can improve their work. But it's not your job to fix everything in the paper. So if there are problems with the grammar, figures, writing, etc., you want to point out that there are problems, but you don't need to go through and fix every instance. And if there are recurring problems through the paper, you can note that there are recurring problems and just note that one time. Also, just be realistic about the time commitment for reviewing. It usually takes at least half a day to review a paper and oftentimes longer for early career researchers. So you should think about this before you accept the invitation to review. All right, so after you've completed your review and turned it in, how are reviews used to make an editorial decision? Well, the associate editors and editors-in-chief all said that their decisions are based almost entirely on the feedback from reviewers. But editors generally weigh the arguments for why a paper should be accepted or rejected or revised more than the actual recommendation. So it's really important to argue your case. What happens when two reviewers disagree on their recommendation? Maybe one reviewer says accept and one reviewer says reject. I asked this question to the ASLO editors, and these were their most common responses. Sometimes the associate editor acts as a third reviewer themselves and is the tiebreaker. Sometimes after receiving those first two conflicting reviews, the associate editor will solicit a third reviewer to be the tiebreaker. And sometimes the associate editor uses the better argued position or the more detailed review. So again, the why really matters in a review. A few final tips. Remember that editors are people too. You can contact ASLO editors at any point with your questions as you're reviewing papers. They're happy to answer any of your questions. And just remember the golden rule of reviewing. Review for others as you would have others review for you. We are all both authors and reviewers. So when we're reviewing, we want to treat authors the way we would want to be treated. That's in terms of being fair, being polite, and also being timely so we don't hold up someone else's manuscript. And thank you all for your interest in reviewing. These are a couple quotes from ASLO editors. They all appreciate what you do. We are in the middle of peer review week, so you can check out other peer review resources associated with peer review week. And I'm excited to move on to the question and answer portion of the webinar. Okay, so the rest of our time today will be a question and answer session. So you can type your questions in the chat and we will pose as many questions as we can to our panelists. You'll remain anonymous through this. So first we want to start with a few of the questions that you asked when you registered for the event. And there were a number of questions related to how much time one should spend reviewing a manuscript. So I'm going to pose this question to Paul in a second, but first I want to ask you. So I'm launching a poll now, asking you if you've reviewed a paper before, how long you usually spend reviewing a paper. So I'll give you about 10 seconds here. Okay, great. And here are our results. So it looks like most people spend between 4 and 8 hours, but some spend between 8 to 12 hours or even more than 12 hours. And there are a few people that can get their reviews done in less than 4 hours. So, Paul, I'll pose this question to you now. Do you have any advice about how long in general one should spend reviewing papers?
Well, one comment first, which is that with practice, you get faster. So if that 12 hours and up was really intimidating, you'll probably get it down to some shorter time than that, but everybody has their own individual process for reviewing, and you have to find that process that works for you. I thought that Rosie's advice about a reviewing process was excellent. It will lead you to be an efficient reviewer. The thing to really keep in mind is whatever process you develop that is unique to you, think about if you have ever gotten a review that you thought, that was really helpful. That made my paper better. That made my proposal better. That's the value of a good review. So think about that value and think about the amount of effort that you need to put in to follow that golden rule. Review for others as you would have them review for you. Whatever it takes, honestly, whatever it takes is, it's well worthwhile. It's a feel-good experience to turn in a great, helpful, you know in your heart, this is going to help the person review.
Great. Okay, our next question is for Chris. Chris, do you have any tips for how to provide a constructive review when many papers will go beyond the range of your expertise?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that was actually handled really nicely in the video we just saw. I mean, today with all these really multidisciplinary papers, it's hard to find someone who can cover everything discussed within a paper, right? So I think you need to think about that before you accept the review. You know, read the abstract, see if it's something that you feel comfortable handling as an expert in the field and kind of giving critiques on. If not, don't accept the review. But if you do and you come across something like that, I think it's perfectly fine just to make that clear to the AE in charge or assigned to the manuscript that you just don't feel comfortable for a certain aspect of that paper. You know, you agreed to review the paper, so there should be things that you are able to comment on and that you're very comfortable with, right? So you can still provide really good constructive criticism. You can read the paper, think about the structuring of the paper, look at the data and the interpretation, see if kind of the interpretation is well supported by either the data or within the literature. So I think that's really helpful, but just make sure that you're honest if there's something that you don't feel as comfortable commenting upon. And that could be submitted within your review to the AE as kind of like a confidential comment. You could indicate it there, or as was instructed in the video, you can actually reach out to the AE beforehand if you just think it's really something outside of your wheelhouse that you don't feel comfortable at all commenting on. So remember, you're a good scientist. There are things you can comment on. You can be really constructive, even if you're not as much of an expert in one topic.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question is for Jim. Jim, are the reviewers always right? And what is the role of the editors?
I don't know why that question made me smile, if reviewers are always right. Let me address that 1 second. Let me talk about the roles of the editors. And I would really be interested in the answers to this question from the other editors. From my perspective, the roles, the editors-in-chief have 2 roles to play. The first is to make the ultimate editorial decision on the fate of a manuscript that's been reviewed. And the second is to help authors craft the best paper they possibly can. And that second part of the answer might be a surprise to some of the people following this webinar, but remember that those of us who are now in editorial positions were authors long before we began our tenure as editors. So we've spent our entire careers as authors. And when I function as an editor-in-chief of LNO Letters, I try to do that from the perspective of authors. And so I think it's important for those listening to know that we're not adversaries, that we want your paper to be published. And when you think about editors, think about them as helpers. We're here to help you write the best paper you can. In terms of the question about whether reviewers are always right, the short answer is no. And there is, in every distribution, there are outliers. And all of the editors on the screen here have seen reviews that we could judge as outliers. They just were inappropriate, they were not helpful. For whatever reason, they were invalid. And so this occurs. It's rarer than people would guess. And I want to kind of comfort people listening to this, because I don't think this is a major problem if we get an outlier and invalid review. And the reason for that is that the system has checks and balances. So for example, we have 2 reviewers, and I've never seen a case where a paper had 2 outlier reviews. One of the important roles and functions of the associate editors is to identify reviews that are outliers, that are invalid, and basically discount them. LNO Letters has a cross peer review process where each reviewer gets to see the reviews from the other reviewer. That's part of the checks and balances process. And the worst case scenario is that if we have 1 invalid review, we have 1 valid review, we've got the evaluation from the associate editor and the evaluation from the editor-in-chief. So I don't think that this is a serious problem.
All right, great. Okay, our next question will go to Dave. Dave, what constitutes a conflict of interest? More publicly available large synthesis data sets means more likely overlap between projects.
Cool. That's a good question. And I hope people will pay a little bit more attention to these types of things as we start seeing papers come in. But to answer the question directly, this is something that I think all of us would agree on. read the guidelines for the journal. They're explicitly detailed what a conflict of interest is. Where, you know, Rosie mentioned mentors and mentee relationships, someone in your own institution, someone with whom you've published a paper or writing a grant proposal with, those types of things. Those are the obvious conflicts. And the complication, and that's the second part of this question, and Julia can tell you this a lot. I collaborate immensely in Gleon, and so my name shows up on authors, on author list of 65 people. Many of them I don't know. If I get a paper for them, do I have a conflict? And so we have to get into the idea of what might be perceived as a conflict, as opposed to a real conflict. And so if my name shows up on a paper with someone, and then next time I'm editing the paper and they've sent to me, even though I may not have known that person, the public will see my name next to that person's name on an author list. And so it's a perceived conflict. There may not be a real conflict, but I'll send that to Julia and she can take over. And it's done that a lot. So I ask people to be careful about those types of things. If you ever think that there might be a conflict or not a conflict, you're welcome to contact me ahead of time. This is the relationship. I worked with this person 10 years ago. I haven't seen them since. We don't collaborate anymore. I think I can do this in an unbiased manner. That's perfectly acceptable as long as you're open with it. One of the biggest issues that I see with conflicts that authors don't necessarily pick up on is if you're writing a paper and you've got 10 co-authors, you have to think about the potential conflicts of interest of your co-authors. And so it's very often I'll get recommended reviewers or recommended AEs on a paper by an author. It comes in, they've got an author, you know, suggested reviewers or a suggested AE. We send it out to them and they write back, I'm the former PhD student of author number 6. So what I'd ask you is when you're writing multi-authored papers, check with all your authors that the reviewers that you're suggesting don't have any conflicts with any of them. So that's the biggest problem. Most people are very good about picking out conflicts and stating what those conflicts might be, even if they're negative conflicts. If you are in a field that is split over a particular idea, 2 paradigms fighting each other, you might identify person X has, you know, we've been in great arguments and meetings and something. I don't think I'll get a fair review from this person. Let us know that. Doesn't necessarily mean we might not go to that person for advice, particularly if they're an expert, but at least we know that we have that information that we can use when we're making our editorial decisions. So bottom line is, if you think there might be a conflict or you're not sure, contact your AE, contact me, contact the editors of the other journals, and we can help you work through that. Read the guidelines, they'll help you. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Julia, what efforts are being made to prevent harassment by reviewers? For instance, condescending or disparaging remarks towards authors.
So that's a great question. And I think as well, I also sort of point out the same thing that Jim pointed out. This is not, while I see it a lot on Twitter, lots of threads about the review process, I don't think it's something we have a drastic problem with in the ASLO journals. I've been editor for a couple of years now, and I rarely see any remark that's not respectful. But I think it's a learning process for both the editor and the reviewers as well. So if we get something that is maybe a little disrespectful or the tone's not quite right, you have to remember reviewers might have just not quite got it right. They might have been quite busy when they wrote the review. So at that point, the editor will go back to the reviewer and sort of before it gets sent out, and then maybe just point out that perhaps the tone isn't quite right, and recommend that they rephrase it and sort of have a bit of a conversation so the reviewer can learn as well. And then if that happens, then we can sort of go ahead and send it out to the authors. One thing that we definitely try not to do is the editors will read all reviews, the associate editor and then the editor-in-chief. And if there are comments that we think cross the line, and again, it is a bit of a judgment call, but basically we won't send those out. They should not really get out to the authors. So at that point, we'd go back to the reviewers and maybe ask them to rephrase a few bits. Or one thing we don't want to do is sort of rewrite the review for the reviewers. That's not really on. So it's more going back to them and pointing out that, you know, might be a PhD student, or even just, and perhaps they would like to change the tone a little. That's basically it.
Thanks. All right, next question is for Jim. Jim, what constitutes a major flaw precluding publication?
Oh, yeah, this is a big question. I think that what we are looking for as editors is papers that measurably advance scientific knowledge. So if a paper isn't making a contribution that we would judge as being innovative and impactful, it's probably not a paper that's going to be accepted by an ASLO journal. I think one of the common bases for making rejection decisions is that the authors have written grand conclusions, but those conclusions are just not well supported by the data or the analyses. Oftentimes they're overly speculative. We want rock solid conclusions that are unequivocal and supported by appropriate data and appropriate analyses. I think maybe absence of innovation, over speculation, taking the data further than the data can go, flaws in methods, flaws in analyses that can't be easily corrected. And again, I think the function of editors, both the editors-in-chief and the associate editors, is to highlight the flaws in papers, identify which ones are fatal, and then give some suggestions about how those flaws can be corrected so that authors can rethink their research, recompose their paper for submission to another journal. One of the really difficult challenges of being an editor-in-chief is this division between a rejection and a rejection with the possibility of resubmitting as a brand new paper. This is one of the really hard parts about being an editor. But I can tell you that it's not fun to write a rejection letter. It's not fun to read a rejection letter. But I feel like when we reach the point where we have made a recommendation that the paper is not going to be accepted for publication in a national ASLO journal, a lot of thought has gone into that decision. And I don't know about the other editors, but almost always I feel like that is the right decision for this journal. And it's in the best interest of the authors to rethink their study and think about submitting to another journal.
Okay, great. Question for Dave. Requirements for open data and open code are becoming more common. What responsibility do reviewers have for evaluating the quality or technical aspects of data and code?
It's a perfect question for Jim. And I say so because ONO Letters does have that policy. ONO is getting ready to shift over. We're going to try to shift. Our goal is by January 22 to go to open data, public access, data repositories, those types of things. And we're actually in the process of trying to design what that would look like, what we're going to hold our reviewers responsible for, our editors, in the editorial office. Again, Jim can add to this, having much more experience, but just as a scientist, I think we all, when we're reviewing papers, we do want to see data. We do want to make sure that particularly really novel, game-changing conclusions, we want to make sure that the experimental design, the data, everything are intact, that actually can help support the conclusions made. So I'm for definitely having everything open. I like the concept of open science, open data, and that I'm probably on the edge of a generation that is not really into wanting to do all the trouble of getting data uploaded into these repositories. It's not something that we're used to doing, but I think this is where early career researchers have had a major impact on science and moving us to that direction. So I think reviewers would simply have the same responsibility at any time they're reviewing, is not necessarily to check every single data point and curate the data set, but generally look through the data. Do we see the data supporting the general conclusions? I think that we're all going to do that anyway. We're doing that generally with figures and tables, but this gives you that extra level of certainty to go that step further if you want to, but it'll really come down to the AEs and the editors to make sure that those data are there. And we do expect people to use curated, reputable data repositories. So there's also that secondary check as well. But Jim, you might want to add something since you actually do this.
Yeah, LNO Letters has a very strict requirement on publishing the exact data set that the authors analyzed and presented in their paper with a unique URL and in an easily findable repository. It also requires a data availability statement in the manuscript, and that the data publication be cited in the article. And we're in this transition phase where the scientific community is not fully up to speed and knowledgeable about the process of publishing data and meeting these requirements. I would say that maybe half of the papers submitted to LNO Letters on initial submission don't meet the requirements. And so we don't have nearly the number of submissions that LNO does. And so I have time available to validate whether the authors have met the data publication requirements. So it's actually a job that I do myself. The associate editors are beginning to learn themselves to do this. I think this is going to be a big challenge when the journals like LNO that receive 600 or 700 submissions a year, we're going to have to rely more on reviewers to validate whether the authors have met the data publication requirements or not. So we're in this transitional phase. We have a lot to learn about this.
Great. Question for Julia. Do the editors think that there is a bias associated with Southern Hemisphere authors? And are LNO journals considering the idea of double-blind peer review?
Good question. I'd like to think there isn't a bias for Southern Hemisphere authors. I would say LNO typically would like to publish those papers that take big advances, so sort of more process-based or knowledge-based, so it doesn't actually matter where the study was conducted. So I hope not. I hope that I certainly pick a lot of Southern Hemisphere reviewers for my papers. And double-blind is something we are considering and or sort of talking about implementing, but I can see some questions popped up. There are difficulties with doing that, and so if we do it, we'd like to kind of make sure we get it right. And I think that's actually something that the Raelyn Cole Fellows have been working on, looking at how other journals do this and how they overcome some of those challenges. So it is an ongoing conversation, and we're going to continue to have those conversations.
Jim, you have something to add?
Yeah, I wonder if Bridget, the other Raelyn Cole Fellow, could say something about this, because I know that double-blind is something that she's thought a lot about. She knows more about it than I do, and I just wonder if maybe Bridget would like to say something about this.
Yeah, this is something that we've been really interested in looking into as Raelyn Cole Fellows, and thinking about how we can reduce bias in the review process. It's actually been shown even in the stage of inviting reviewers, if you don't show the reviewer the author list, they're more likely to accept than if you do, just because people associate different qualities of research with names that they recognize. This is something right now we're sort of in a data exploration stage with Wiley to look at information about papers that have already been published and the way that they're reviewed. It's actually quite involved to change the submission system in a way that allows for double-blind review. So sort of taking steps to look at this and think about how either double-blind or versions of double-blind can be implemented in LNO if we think that they're going to reduce bias associated with the entire process. And maybe, I don't know, Rosie, if you want to add anything too.
Yeah, I think you got it. Okay. Dave, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just one of the things, and Bridget and I have talked about this as well. One of the issues of going to double blind is the question that came to me first is conflict of interest. How do you establish potential conflicts of interest when you don't know? So the editors and AEs may not know that, you know, Paul and Jim wrote a paper in PNAS last week. So we send them, you know, we remove all the names, just send it to Paul to review. He says, yes, I'll do it. And then he gets the paper. It turns out he's actually reviewing a paper of one of his colleagues. So that's, we're such a small group of scientists in the aquatic sciences. That's one of the biggest worries I have about going that method. And if anybody has ideas of how to get around it, I'd love to hear them. Thanks.
Okay, question for Paul. How should a reviewer deal with a manuscript that has numerous errors of syntax and grammar, often these obscure scientific reasoning?
Oh, that is a tough one. The vast majority of manuscripts that I receive at ASLO Methods are multi-authored. When I see really obvious, typically it's an English as a second language kind of an issue. When I see really obvious errors in syntax and grammar, I think, didn't the co-authors read the paper before they submitted it? And I feel like, you know, that really is something that people have to recognize when they're writing a manuscript. You can't rely on the lead author to take all responsibility for that type of problem. Everyone has to participate. From the reviewer's perspective, if it, on that first reading, such as in your suggested process, on that first reading, and I use that process myself, if you feel that you can't give it a fair review, you can't really read it well, then it's time to not do a full review. That actually constitutes a special kind of fatal issue. And the editor is going to have to send it back and ask them to rework it before we can even consider the manuscript. If you can give it a fair review, but you're really annoyed by the writing, give it the fair review and be polite yet explicit about the fact that it was difficult to read, and then turn it over to the editors because they're going to have to do extra work with the author to make it a better paper. That would be my advice.
Great. All right, question for Chris. When conducting a peer review, is it advised to focus on one aspect of the paper at a time? For example, first focus on the scientific method, then on statistics, then on grammar and diction? Please advise.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think if you focus on certain kind of compartments of the paper at the time, you kind of miss the overall flow of the paper and how it's put together. I like reading a paper from start to finish just to kind of see how the story develops, right? And if you're picking up little chunks of the paper here and there, you kind of miss those conjunctions of the different sections together. So I think that could be a bit of a limitation for doing so. That being said, there may be certain times where a method isn't exactly clear to you. So you may have to go back and focus on that section after you give an initial reading of the paper, because there could be something developed in the discussion that isn't set up earlier in the paper. I think that's one of the things I struggle with the most when you get to the discussion section and something just kind of comes out of the blue at you and you're like, whoa, where did this come from? So if you kind of do a chunk at a time, you might miss that. And then you need to go back to see if maybe you just missed that in your initial reading and it was there to begin with, or whether or not that's one of your critiques of the paper, that the authors need to set that up either in the intro or in the methods section. So I don't know. I don't know if the other authors have advice on that, but I like to read it as a paper, as a story first, and then go back through it.
All right. Next question for Jim. It is becoming more common for early career researchers to help their PIs with reviews. Is this something that ASLO journals encourage?
Yeah, this is a question that the editors have discussed quite a bit in the last year. And we've actually just recently changed the letter that is sent out to reviewers. And we make it clear in that letter, if we're sending it, for example, to a senior scientist, we make it clear in that letter that senior scientists have options if they don't have the time to review the paper themselves. And one option is if they have a postdoc or an advanced PhD student in their lab, they can suggest that that person in their lab do the review. The other option that they have is to use this as a teaching opportunity and pick somebody in their lab who maybe isn't quite ready to do a full-blown review herself or himself, but can do it as a learning exercise with the mentor. So this is something that we are very interested in. We're trying to be proactive in terms of making it clear that there is a room in the peer review process for early career researchers. And at the very beginning of this webinar, Rosie talked about the fact that we're having great difficulty finding timely reviews for papers. I've actually handled a paper that took 19 invitations before we got two to agree. And as Rosie pointed out, we have this pool of qualified reviewers, and including those of you who are listening to this webinar, and that pool is not being tapped. And I think that one of the solutions to the difficulty in getting reviewers is to tap the pool of early career researchers, to do it either jointly with mentors or to take on responsibilities themselves. So we actually need your help in how we can reach out to early career researchers to draw you into the peer review process. You are a valuable pool of talent that is not being tapped, and we'd like to hear from you how we can tap into that pool.
Dave, you have something to add?
Yeah, thanks. We've talked about this a lot, and there are two things that I think you guys could help with is, one, don't be shy to go to your advisors, to your mentors and say, hey, I want some experience reviewing papers. If they get a paper and the journal allows it, like the ASLO journals do, great, you get into the system. They then will let us know as part of the response to the review. There's a place for them to tell us who helped with the review. We get an email address. We then ask, as that person develops, please have them contact the editorial office and provide an email so that we can get them in the system. The second thing, and I think this is why we are having some trouble getting reviewers. My record, by the way, at LNO is 27 requests to get a paper review. And it's actually not an outlier. There's quite a few right behind that. But you early career researchers are getting jobs and you're moving. You're going from school to your first job. You might get a postdoc and the second postdoc and on. Remember to update your information in the journals that you want to review for. So we often will send out a review request and get back a bounced email because the email is no longer working. So one of the things that you need to remember is simply keep updating your address with the journals that you want to be part of. If you're a member of ASLO, make sure you get your new email address updated as soon as possible. That will help ensure that you stay in the pool, and it will help ensure that we then get to ask you because we can find you.
Awesome. I think there's a couple of questions that I think would be nice follow-up questions to this theme. So for an early career researcher who receives review requests directly but doesn't feel fully confident but would like the experience in practice, could they ask a mentor to do a joint review with them? I guess, Dave, we're talking to you. So do you have any?
Sure. I see no reason that don't just contact your AE and just pass it through the AE. Is this okay? This is who that person is. And I think that would be fine. As long as we know who the reviewers are and we're giving credit to the right people, I think that would be fine. But I think Jim or Paul said it, if you get invited as an early career researcher, you're being invited because you've made a name for yourself in that particular field. Don't be shy about sharing your experience. Everyone can pick out good science and bad science, so don't feel that you can't do a review. There's lots of advice in Rosie's presentation up front. There's all those resources that she provided, but contact your AE, contact the editor, and do not feel that you can't do that review. Would be what I say. Others probably can kick in.
Oh, Paul?
Unmute myself. Just wanted to mention that it is really uncommon in L&O methods to have 2 or 3 reviews that all say the same thing. Total agreement, same recommendation. By far the norm is to have reviews that are complementary to one another because the reviews focus on different things that the reviewer is expert in. So don't feel that because you're not perhaps completely comfortable reviewing all bits of the manuscript that somehow you have to reach out to your mentor and ask them for help. That's actually what the associate editor is doing and picking reviewers. They're trying to find people who will sort of have complementary expertise that will come up with a full picture of the manuscript. There's no harm in asking your mentor for assistance. I think it might actually be kind of a fun thing to do, but you don't need to do it.
Great, thanks. All right, next question for Jim. In the general scientific community, this participant has heard of senior researchers suggesting postdocs and advanced grad students as alternate reviewers, but those with exotic sounding names don't get invited while their lab mates do. Does ASLO provide clear guidance to all associate editors to be fair in providing peer review opportunities to all qualified early career researchers?
We don't have a written policy, but I think it's just implicitly understood by all of us that there is no such bias.
All right, good, clear answer. Let's see. One thing I want to point out oh, sorry, Julia, you have something to add?
I might add to that, in that one of the things we do when we're looking to expand the sort of associate editor pool or the editorial board is we're really trying to select from as diverse, to bring together a diverse group as we can. I think we've done a really good job in some aspects. We're 50-50, I think, now for L&O for gender diversity. Obviously, that's not the only measure, but we're really trying to bring on as many diverse, sort of to get a diverse and editorial board as possible. It is always a work in progress, but we will continue to do so. And it's something that we are very aware of when we're trying to select associate editors and also reviewers as well. So hopefully there is no bias, but it is something we're actively working towards improving.
Jim, something to add?
Yeah, this topic is related to a comment that Patricia Garcia made online. She said the proportion of ecology papers from Southern hemispheres is very inferior compared to the Northern. This is a fact. This is an established fact. And I think collectively the ASLO editors are committed to addressing that problem. And so for L&O letters, we've had some turnover in members of the editorial board and in the associate editors. And one of the criteria that I was looking for to replace associate editors who have left the board is to target scientists from the Southern Hemisphere. And I think you all will be interested to know that, you know, 2 of the Raelyn Cole Fellows are here participating in this. The 6th Raelyn Cole Fellow has been selected. Her name is Rita Franco Santos, and she's from Brazil. So the next Raelyn Cole Fellow will be from the Southern Hemisphere, and I hope we see many more after her.
Great. Okay, next question is for Julia. What are the editor's thoughts on sharing reviewer names with the submitted manuscript authors? Would it help reviewers to be more accountable for their reviews?
That's it. That's a good question. I personally don't sign my reviews, and I know lots of people that do. I think I certainly would not do that without permission. I think that's still very much a personal choice of the reviewer. I think an early career reviewer in particular might feel a little uncomfortable, maybe strongly criticizing a paper from a more senior author. I think in general, I have a colleague that says basically he signs all of his reviews because he thinks that you should be able to stand by your opinions. Ideally, we could all sign our reviews and people wouldn't hold grudges, but I think as a general principle, anonymity helps to protect the reviewer a little bit. So I think we shouldn't enforce it, but also equally, if people do want to sign their reviews and they're happy for their reviews to be signed, then we will release the name of the reviewer to the authors. But it's really the reviewer choice. I think academia is still not perfect enough in terms of its power balances to be able to do that without consequence.
Great. All right, I want to launch one more poll for everyone. And this one is about how long your peer review report is. So you should see the poll now. So if you've done a peer review before, how long is that final report usually? And then afterwards, how about I'll give this question to Dave to think about if he has an answer for an ideal review length. Just a couple more seconds here. Okay. All right, so most people said that their reviews are usually either 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 pages, with a few people with reviews that are over 4 pages long. Dave, do you have any thoughts about this and if there is an ideal length that our review reports should be?
Sorry, I was actually correcting my background, as someone pointed out. I've got word corrected, ASLO became also, so do not write me to also.org. No, there is no correct answer for how long it should be. It should simply be long enough. It should be thorough. It should be enough so that when an AE or editor reads it, they understand what your feeling is for that paper. The outline that Rosie gave up front is perfect. Start with the bigger picture. What are the novel contributions? That's one of the things we really look at for ASLO. We want novel science. We don't want incremental science. So I would, get immediately to that major question: is this novel? Is this going to change paradigms? Is it going to challenge dogma? Those types of things. Get straight to it. You might then get into some major concerns that you really think need to be tweaked a little bit to improve the message. But I wouldn't get into competing with we're already reading a 25-page manuscript. We don't want a 25-page review of that manuscript because it's not going to help. There are going to be many other opportunities for the authors to go through. We certainly want you to say there's a lot of grammatical error, there's a lot of syntax issues, there's all those types of things. You can summarize them, but you don't need to detail everyone. Don't wordsmith the paper at that point. We've got plenty of time to do that, but then we can ask, one of the questions earlier. We might, even if we see a paper that has just really poor writing because English is second, third, or fourth language for a particular person, we'll simply ask them to go to Wiley or other professional writing services first. So we won't reject the paper. We'll simply withdraw it and ask them to improve it, put it back into the system, go out for review. But we're really interested in the science. So keep your comments to the science. Tell us what's great about the science or what's not. Tell us how the presentation of that science can be improved. That's really what we want to do. We want working with the reviewers and the authors, the authors, reviewers, the editors. We want to make these papers as good as we can make them. Because we do get a lot of papers, the average paper, we reject a lot of papers that are really good science, but they may not be novel or they just aren't competing with some of the other papers. But your role should really be help that person, because I think someone said this before, you want reviewers to help you. And I one of the highlight in the bulletin for I highlight authors or reviewers and AEs is L&O reviewers are really good at what they do, and papers get so much better. We can get really, really great papers, but by the time they've gone through the review, they're really great papers. And that's what we want. That's what we want to do, and that should be a sense of pride. There are some journals that will pay you to do reviews. We pay you by your pride of having contributed to a great L&O paper, or for the letters or for methods. So no particular length, just thorough and the right information to allow the AE and the editor to make the right decision.
Great. All right, we have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to pose the last question to Chris. Chris, do you think that PhD students should do a peer review for at least one paper as a requirement for completing their PhD? Maybe this would help increasing the pool of reviewers.
It's a great thought. I know PhD students tend to be so overwhelmed with coursework and research that I'm not sure another requirement would be good. I do know in some of the bigger labs that I've been a part of, there have been reviews that have been done kind of as a lab group. And I think that's really helpful to get feedback from everyone, so everyone kind of learns how that process works. It's definitely a great experience. Whether or not that is kind of a more official review that the mentor would go to the AE and say, hey, listen, I'm thinking about doing this with my entire lab. Is that okay? Or if that's just done a little more informally. I think it's really instructive, but again, it is a lot of work. And so it is a bit of a commitment. I think it's good to understand how the process unfolds with someone who's written a lot of reviews. But again, I think adding that as a requirement might be a little tough. So I would say probably not, but definitely good experience if you can do so informally.
All right, thanks. Well, we are all out of time, but thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to our other panelists for this great informative Q&A session. For everyone who registered for this event, you'll have access to the slides, and also we recorded this, so you'll have access to the recording afterwards. So happy peer review week, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody.